we actually pop up. Maybe, I don't know.
It's loading.
Loading. We're all poised like.
There we go. We are live, so I'm gonna leave, and you guys have fun. See you guys later.
Perfect. We're all poised. Oh, there we go. All right. So welcome everyone to our latest CanCon Line event. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Brandon Crilly. I'm one of the programming leads for CanCon. And so I just wanted to welcome you all to here first and give you a couple of details before I turn things over to our moderator, Ashley Dang. I'm so incredibly excited for this panel. You have no idea. We have an amazing lineup, some amazing questions, focusing specifically on emerging Caribbean diaspora writers in conversation. It's going to be a fabulous, fabulous chat. Just a couple of housekeeping things before you get started. So I wanted to give a shout out and a thanks to Susan Palumbo, who helped behind the scenes in terms of putting this panel together and getting it organized. She's also a programmer for FIACon and a writer as well. Go check out her stuff. It's awesome. Also a shout out to Marco Caltrera, our webmaster, who's the only reason why any of this tech works and explains a lot of it to me because I have no idea what any of it really does. And then last but certainly not least, Courtney Fernandez, who's another programmer for CanCon and our chat moderator today. So for those of you that are watching on YouTube, looking at the chat, we do have a chat moderator, so don't be surprised if there's a little bit of a delay in terms of the comments going up. There may be some time at the end of this panel to take some audience questions. If you would like to throw a question at the panel, just type question in all caps before you put it in, just to make it easy for Courtney to spot. And like I said, we might have some time at the end for that, but it'll depend on how the conversation is going. After the panel, for those of you that are interested, we have our lounge open here in the CanCon members area through an app called Wonder. If you haven't checked it out before, it's this awesome platform that's kind of in beta where it tries to simulate the feeling of being and in a conference floor. You can kind of move around and talk to people, kind of like being in a Zoom chat. So most of our panelists are going to be in there after the panel. So if you want to go in and hang out and talk to people, that will be available to you. And then last but certainly not least, I just wanted to do a quick plug for our next CanCon Line event, which is going to be on December 2nd. We're doing a partnership with the Ephemera reading series in Toronto for CanFemera. So we're going to have a panel on December the 2nd, I believe at 7 p.m., focusing on their theme for the month, which is comfort. So we'll have panelists Kelly Robson, Amal El-Motar, Christina Vasilevsky, and Mark Oshiro, with Ephemera's own Katie Brisky moderating. So stay tuned for details on that. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Ashley. Hope you folks have fun, and thanks again for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. All righty. So hello and welcome everyone to CanCon Line's Caribbean Diaspora Writers Conversation. Today we'll be discussing a little bit about the Caribbean and its history, and particularly the way that we, as Caribbean diaspora, engage with it as science fiction, fantasy, and horror writers. So we'll go around the panel. If our panelists could introduce yourselves, preferred pronouns, and tell us a little bit about your work. Let's start alphabetically with Evan, and then we'll go to Nandy.
Oh, there we go. Just took myself off mute. Thank you very much for having me, CanCon, and to all the other panel members for being here. An absolute pleasure. My name's Evan Winter. I'm the writer of 2 books now, since one just came out on Tuesday, The Rage of Dragons and The Fires of Vengeance. And my pronouns are he, him.
Okay, hi everyone, nice to meet you. I'm Nandy Taylor. My debut novel is Given. It's a YA fantasy romance, and it's really just kind of a love letter to my 15-year-old self. And my pronouns are she, her.
Oh, guess I'm next?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Preemi Mohammed, she, her. My debut novel came out this March, Beneath the Rising, which is a cosmic horror, sci-fi, fantasy, alternate history. It's got some genre problems. And the sequel is coming out next March. And I also have 30-ish short stories written. And I have a novella coming out with Canadian press, ECW Press, next fall, which I'm very excited about.
That's so cool. Okay. My name is Therese Mason-Pierre. My pronouns are she, her. I am a writer and poet. I live in Toronto. My background is Grenadian. My My parents are from St. George's and St. David's in Grenada, and I'm also co-editor-in-chief of Augur magazine.
And I am your moderator, Ashley Thang. I am a Canadian-born Chinese-Jamaican writer. My work can be found over at Nightmare Magazine, Firestar Magazine, and Queen Swords Press. So let's just dive in. The Caribbean is a large, very diverse region of the Americas that frequently carries homogenized stereotypes from those living in contiguous North America. I know that as someone who is extremely Asian, I'm often not believed when I mention that I'm Chinese Jamaican. And usually when I do mention that my father was born in Jamaica, they usually assume that he's Black. Given that there's a very specific image of the Caribbean held by those on contiguous North America, do you find yourself forced into writing an identity based off how you look? Do the perceptions of the Caribbean affect how you approach your work? We'll go around again in alphabetical order, starting with Evan.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question, Ashley. I think that it is so difficult because being part of the Caribbean diaspora is an interesting place to be for me. My parents are Guyanese, but then for work and education, they moved to England and I was born there, and then we went to Africa and then to North America. And so, and most of my family now lives in America. So yeah, it's a tricky thing to sort of figure out where I fit in the world a little bit, even though my family is so very, very Caribbean. And when I'm writing, I think what I do is I try to take a lot of what makes me me and what makes my family uniquely my family and put it into the books. And so I don't consciously attempt to maybe specifically do anything specifically, pardon me, Caribbean, but it sort of always ends up coming out in the writing because even sort of the way that my house, like the way that I grew up, sort of the power dynamics in the home, the relationships in the home, the relationships with family, it all comes from that sort of Caribbean sort of pull, that Caribbean sort of like culture and feel. And so that's what I know. And I do very much know that that's what I try to put into the stories I tell, because that to me is my default. That's my worldview and that's my normal.
Okay.
Thank you, Evan. Yeah, Nandy.
This is a great question. I don't know if I'd say forced. I don't think forced is quite the right word, but I am cognizant of the fact that, quite frankly, writing stuff that kind of aligns with what I look like will just sell better. But unfortunately for me, it's what I also want to write. I really only want to write Black women protagonists right now. And as for the Caribbean, influencing my my work, I think my debut is the first one where I consciously actually wanted to represent a culture that was visibly Caribbean. But it's same as what Evan said, it probably comes out subconsciously just because that's who I am and that's how I was raised. And, my upbringing is going to inform what I write.
Yeah, thank you. Courtney.
Yeah, similar to Nandy and Evan. And I absolutely hear you when you say, with what I look like, people are expecting me to write a certain thing. And in fact, if I saw my name on a book at the bookstore, I'd probably pick it up and be like, oh, this is probably like an immigrant story with arranged marriages or something. And maybe the girl runs away and she falls in love with an unsuitable boy from the wrong caste, something, yada, yada. People look at me and they expect me to be writing an Indian story. And that's tricky because, first of all, and Evan can probably attest to this, like it's weird to look at somebody from supposedly South America and say, yeah, you look like you're from India though. And your name, well, first of all, your name's a train wreck. It's both Hindu and Muslim. But there is the expectation. I don't think anyone has ever verbally suggested that I write about my background or my heritage or anything like that, but I agree that it's coming out anyway. And I think what is coming out is the diaspora experience of being in one culture, having come from another culture and feeling the pull or the tug or the conflict of being raised around both cultures and kind of what's been lost and what's been kept. Like for my family, for instance, growing up, practically all I knew of Caribbean or Indian culture was the food and the music and the frankly bootlegged VHS tapes that my parents would get from the West Indian store. So if there's stuff coming in there, I think it's more subtle than that. It's like you guys said, you know, it's your values, it's your upbringing, it's what you choose to focus on. It's not so much the culture per se, I think.
Yeah, I like that. I like the idea that there's a kind of an underlying thread that comes from growing up into a certain environment that ends up lining it, but it's not a punch in the face, very obvious kind of way. Therese.
Yeah. So I feel like a lot of people, when they think of the Caribbean, they will like initially or probably think of Jamaica or some sort of like pan, or specifically Black Jamaica or Black Jamaicans, which is like, for example, in your case, like, you know, Chinese people aren't allowed to be Jamaican because only Black people can be Jamaican. So that's a way you'll be racialized when you get to North America. But that's also because there's not so much taught about the history of the Caribbean. It has such a rich history and the regions, and there are all sorts of people who have come and lived there. Can anyone hear me?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay. So I'm not Jamaican. People might look at me and their question is like, "Are you Jamaican?" And I say, "No. I was born in Canada." But I try to write about whatever I know about Grenada and its mythology and its folklore as much as I can. I get a lot of that from my parents, who will just like very casually like sneak it in, like, you know, just throughout my my upbringing. And whenever I would press them for more, they'd be like, "Why are you interested? Like, this is just myth. This is folklore. It's not real." But I try to include that in my writing as much as I can and let it shape my work. I don't necessarily feel like forced into writing a particular identity or anything based on how I look. For a long time, I was writing a lot of white characters, especially in science fiction and fantasy. And I never really thought that someone like me could write sci-fi or fantasy or someone like me could be a main character in sci-fi and fantasy. So I guess there was some weird cognitive dissonance in that way, where I was a Black person writing sci-fi and fantasy, but at the same time, I thought that Black people couldn't write sci-fi and fantasy. And when I realized that was quite painful, that realization. But now I'm able to sort of explore and read other Grenadian writers or other Caribbean writers, both in the islands and in the diaspora. So I let that shape my work now.
Yeah, and I think that also ties into the whole, actually nicely ties into the next question, which is that the Caribbean diaspora are a diaspora of a diaspora, which means that the dynamic of how we relate to our cultures and our ethnic backgrounds is different than many who have more direct lineage to trace as sci-fi, fantasy, and horror writers. We often work in secondary worlds or speculate dynamics based in but not identical to reality. I know that I personally tend to be most influenced by the dynamics of the culture of the Caribbean and its very multicultural nature. But do you find that your work takes influence from the Caribbean and its culture, or do you look farther back to one of the various cultures that make up the Caribbean's multiple cultures? Or do you instead find yourself influenced by the diaspora experience? We'll go with the same order. So Evan?
Okay, yeah, thank you. Well, my first two books are definitely sort of more secondary world Africa, specifically sort of equatorial to the south on the continent. Although I do use names and sort of landscapes and architecture from all over the continent, because it was really important for me to get the feel of those words and those sort of mental images into readers' minds, because they played such a large part in my own upbringing. And also for me, somewhat similar to what happens in the Caribbean, where I grew up was Zambia, right? And although it is important to understand that Africa is a continent, is a massive place, and the Caribbean is maybe not quite as massive physically, but has so many different cultures and peoples. All of the different cultures and peoples have basically through time come together and mixed. And so a lot of the landscapes, a lot of the sort of the cultural aspects have sort of come together in interesting ways. And so although I'm not attempting to create something that's Pan-African in my own work, I do draw from different parts of the continent because that was real to my experience growing up in Africa. And although my story takes place in sort of Bronze Age times, it sort of is me attempting to understand what happens when people trade and come into contact with one another and all the rest, and some of the conflicts that come into play because of that, and some of the sort of the new societies that come out of that, which I think we very much see in modern sort of the modern Caribbean and in the recent past in the Caribbean, all those societies coming together and having to form new nations once sort of post-colonial times, and trying to figure out who we are in this new reality and how we can maintain a society. And so those are a lot of the questions that are very interesting to me. And I think that's maybe why I write about it. Maybe that's why I wrote about it in the way that I did, because of my background, actually. And because, I saw all the different people that are sort of connected to my family from my background, my Caribbean background.
Nandy.
Yes. So I love this question because it really, my book it takes influence from both. So my main character comes from a secondary world, which is it resembles the Yoruba of Nigeria, and she worships a pantheon of gods reminiscent of the Orisha. And then her love interest, which is the other POV in the book, or point of view in the book, comes from, like you said, a diaspora of a diaspora. So he's mixed race and is half of the colonizing country or empire and half of the Caribbean colonies. He's from a fictional island called San Fentas. And I really had fun playing with this idea of the colonized islands versus the uncolonized islands, and how my main character was treated both by the colonizers, but also the colonized, who have taken on a lot of the beliefs and mannerisms of the colonizers. In particular, she does a form of magic that the colonizing empire kind of shuns and considers primitive. And unfortunately, this belief has kind of leaked into their colonized islanders as well. So she goes there kind of expecting to find camaraderie with the other Black people who look like her, but kind of butts heads with a few of them based on the different beliefs. And that was really fun to explore. So yeah, basically I'm playing with both the Caribbean and the indigenous African culture.
It's a really interesting dynamic to be able to have both of them accessible to you, to be able to explore them. Preemie.
Yeah, this was such an interesting question. And actually, as I was listening to Evan and Nandy talk, and actually also Therese's last answer, I thought, God, I'm kind of jealous, right? Because growing up, my parents really pushed, and again, it was just the four of us, like this little brown dot on a white landscape out here in Edmonton. There's very, very few people of color in the place where I grew up, St. Albert. In my graduating class in high school, just as an example, and I was senior editor of the yearbook, so I know there were 283 people and there were 6 people of color. So, and that was a lot, like, for that year. So my parents really were like, we can't change the color of your skin, but just be as white as possible if you want to succeed. And when you hear that enough from a young age, you grow up like that. So I didn't hear any folklore growing up. I didn't hear any stories. I didn't know, what the mythology was about. And I think they probably didn't know a lot either, because again, it's a diaspora of a diaspora. They would have had to have it from their parents, who were too busy in the cane fields to, probably think about that all that much, or their parents, who were mostly illiterate and the indentured servants, and the British had tried to, prevent them from speaking their native tongues, whatever those were, when they came from India. And they brought them up in the English schools, and they really just tried to iron out as much of the culture as they could. So by the time you get people that are coming to Canada, they don't even have a lot of those stories. So it was never anything that I felt I could directly incorporate into my work unless I did the research from, say, academic sources outside of my family. And I felt even, I feel even now that that would be sort of dishonest in a way. Like, it's not something I have a real connection to. It's something that I would be making a new connection to. So while I feel my stuff kind of explores the Caribbean, it's only in the more general sense that, yes, there are a lot of cultures there that get along, that have prejudices of their own, that have cultural practices of their own, that have borrowed and swapped and traded and stolen and given to one another all these different practices and values and ideas, but also the idea of, you know, the outsider, who's in group, who's out group. You know, when my brother and I would visit family out in Toronto, my cousins would laugh at us. They go, "Oh God, you guys are so white. You're so white." You know, but my Indian friends would laugh at me because, God, you're not very Indian, are you? You know, and my white friends are like, "Man, you're so brown. Like, you can't win."
Nope.
And so in my stories, I'm always trying to push into that, or poke a finger into that feeling of, where do you belong, and who does get to say where you belong, and how much of that is the cultures that came with you, and how much is what you're picking up from what's around you.
Yeah, and I mean, as a Chinese Jamaican that's mostly Chinese, I think that's a lot basically what my family experience is like too, for so much of like being a diaspora for diaspora and how things get lost. A lot of those things are not frequently discussed when we're talking about what the Caribbean is like and what that kind of culture and connection is for diaspora of all kinds. Therese.
So I think that a lot of my work, when I choose to write about the Caribbean, I try to take mainly from the sort of the fantastical or the mythological elements, which is what I'm most interested in as a spec writer. I'm not able, or at least I don't think I'm able at this point right now, to talk about further back, to talk about like West Africa and that kind of slavery that was happening there. And there are other great writers who can speak about that, and I can read their work, and it's fine. I don't have to talk about that, and that's okay. But I still know that there is like a lot of work to do, or for me to do as a writer, in order to understand the significance of the stories and the folklore that I want to engage in with these islands, or with Grenada specifically. And I want to do that in a respectful way. Like as Primi was saying, I know that like sometimes some people, like people in the diaspora, might not have that access to those stories because their parents just might have had more important things to do, or just decided that they weren't that important. And I think that if you're trying to build a new relationship to those stories, and that's okay. Like one of the things I always think about, and something that stops me when I write, is like this intra-community gatekeeping that sometimes happens when you're like, well, you're not from here, so you can't write about these myths, or you can't write about these stories. But I consider myself a part of this community as well, so I can write about that, and I can do that in a mindful way. But as someone who lives in Toronto, who's lived in Toronto for coming on 15 years now, I'm also interested in the diaspora experience. That's the experience that I'm currently living in. I'm not living in Grenada right now, but you know, someone whose parents are Grenadian, someone who has to live with these worlds, and getting very excited when I meet like other Grenadian diaspora people. And I've met like maybe 4 who are also writers, and I'm like, we need to be friends because we're all Grenadians. As someone who like wonders how to relate to the island, even though I don't live there, it's a very unique and strange experience, but I find it fascinating. And I think that there are still a lot of stories, even within this experience, that I can write about, and they're equally valid and they're equally fun to write and share.
Yeah. It's like kind of this weird camaraderie when you find someone who's also from your niche little area, that you're like, hey.
Like we need to be friends.
We need to be friends.
Yeah.
It's like anytime I find another Chinese Jamaican, I'm like, yes. The modern day Caribbean is a blend of African, European, Asian, and cultures of the Americas, but its diversity is the very fraught one with a history of slavery and indentured servitude. In fact, the late Trinidadian historian C.L.R. James described that he viewed what he viewed as the beginnings of a strong Caribbean culture and identity during his scholarship in the 1960s. As a region that is deeply entrenched with the legacy of slavery and colonialism, the push towards an identity of our own has also been very fraught. Emerging writers and artists of the 20th century painted a Caribbean that was alienated by Europe while trying to figure out what made the islands of the Caribbean unique. Still, the Caribbean and its culture continues to be in a state of transition as we push toward decolonization. So when so much of our history is intrinsically linked to the empires of Europe, how do you approach post-colonial, anti-colonial narratives in your work? Do you find that there are pockets of remnant cultural influences in the diaspora? And what have your experiences been when visiting the Caribbean, if you'd like to share it all? Starting off with Evan.
Wow, yeah, that's another great question, and I'm going to try and see what are my thoughts on that. I guess, let me see here. I'm not even sure where to start, really. I think that for me, it's been an interesting experience because, again, my family's Guyanese, which is Guyanese, and Guyana is on the continent of South America, but it's also considered part of the Caribbean. So it's sort of a lot of weird identity things happening there for me, because I wasn't even born there, and I've gone back, but I haven't gone back and spent years or any significant amounts of time there. And so when I came to start writing, it was a real sort of interesting, it was a sort of a struggle to try and figure out, well, whose point of view do I even have? Like, they say write what you know, which is a piece of advice that you can take it or leave it. But I did try and sort of examine that in myself. And I was like, I had to start doubting what I even knew, right? Because I don't, Guyanese ancestry that tracks back to Africa originally, but born in England and grow up in Zambia with British teachers. And then I'm trying to understand what I know when almost everything I've been taught and everything that I'm sort of, all the formalized knowledge that I have came from English teachings, British teachings. And then I'm there trying to find my own way back to something that rings true to me. And I guess that what I ended up trying to do or had to do was say that the story I needed to tell, or wanted to tell anyway, I didn't need to, I guess, but the story I wanted to tell was a story that felt like it reflected my own experience, which was a colonized experience, which was not being quite sure where you fit or where you belong. It was an experience that said that society doesn't always work in your best interests at all, necessarily, and trying to sort of figure out, well, where do you go from here? And again, all of that comes from the fact that my parents are Guyanese. All of that comes from the Caribbean and the history there. And it sort of sits in me even before I knew it was there. That's the story that came out because of that history. And so history plays such a massive and important part in the way I think all of us end up being, and especially in the way that I ended up trying to find my own story to tell.
Yeah, I love that, especially because it's just so hard to separate. It's almost impossible to separate it, even if we're trying to. Nandy.
Yes, so I don't think I've mentioned yet, but my background is Trinidadian. Both of my parents were born in Trinidad and immigrated to Canada, and actually met in Canada, and I was born in Canada. I have a character who, her culture is kind of based on West African, specifically Nigerian folklore and traditions. And my connection to West Africa is tenuous at best, right? It's through tracing where my ancestors most likely would have come from during the slave trade. And I think Therese raises an interesting point where there is that kind of nervousness to write about your ancestral culture. Personally, I think we're a little too hard on ourselves when it comes to that. And I say that because white writers certainly don't have this same crisis of consciousness when writing their pseudo-European fantasy worlds. And when writing POC fantasy, they seem to be just fine with picking and choosing and taking and writing whatever they want. Not that's, obviously we want to write things respectfully. But I think there's a little leeway to be a little bit kinder to ourselves in that regard. And I say this because my character, when we're talking about how we represent anti-colonialism, in my book, I specifically wanted this character so that I could speak to that the ways in which colonialism have kind of stolen our history and our confidence from us. One of the main conflicts in Given is that the main character does magic through something called rune lore, which is just painting runes on the skin, and they'll do things like give you strength or speed or the ability to see far distances. Whereas in the colonizing empire, they do magic through, your standard incantations and things like that. And she ends up going to an academy there on a quest to kind of find a way to save her ailing father. And there's constant clashes about her magic and how it's primitive, and the fact that she's not good at this kind of incantation magic makes her seem like she's not as smart, but really it's just that it's a different form of intelligence, right? And you see that in things like standardized testing today, where it favors kind of more Eurocentric teaching methods. And they, they even go so far as to say that her rune paint that she uses to do runes with uses the blood of infants. These kind of silly rumors that you'll hear about African religions and things like this. So that was kind of what I was going for and what I wanted to reflect. And that's why I have those two different cultures, and kind of even the way that they within the colonized islands, her magic rune lore has been, suppressed and discouraged as well until very recently. And that's when I get into things like, it's not quite post-colonial, my book, but I do get into issues of, say, cultural appropriation now that her form of magic is starting to become, it's almost becoming trendy to be more progressive, where we kind of see this progressiveness as trendiness. So I was making a nod to that in my book as well. So that's definitely how I get into these ideas of anti-colonialism and post-colonialism in Given.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, one of the great flexibilities of writing speculative fiction is that you have this opportunity to be able to imagine new circumstances that use current and real life dynamics. And that's one way we can both explore the colonized and the situations where you have colonized peoples and colonizers, mm-hmm. while you also have the ability to really look at it, form it, and move forward in a way that really only speculative fiction allows you to do. It allows you to really get in there and play around with all of these dynamics and relationships that are entirely under your own control. And that's one of the absolute great things about speculative fiction in general. Primi.
Yeah, similarly to Evan has mentioned, my family's from Guyana. And in terms of the sort of, and this is such an interesting question too, in terms of the sort of like, post-colonial or challenging colonial ideas, I don't work a lot in secondary worlds, but in a lot of worlds that are sort of, next to ours. But where it comes up, what I like to do is shine a spotlight on it, if it's possible, to have people talk about it, point it out, don't just let it slide. Because, yeah, exactly. Guyana is mainland Caribbean, was colonized by the Dutch and the English, and I think briefly the French and the Spanish. Like, it was just kicked around like a soccer ball. And you go down there and half the road signs are in Dutch. And I've only visited once. It was between first and second year university. So I was 17, and I went with my mom, and we stayed with her family in Georgetown. And we made a couple of trips out to Enmore, where my family was from. And I was just, again, a standard Canadian teenager. I hadn't even traveled around Canada all that much. And I thought, is this going to be my first experience of culture shock, even though this is the culture I come from? It absolutely was. I was struck by how British it was, as if, and I know, of course, it had been colonized by the British for a very long time, and the British had really put a stamp on it. But I was struck by how that was still, even now that they were gone, still seen as kind of the goal, the pinnacle of everything you could be, about how, you'd send your kids to the best British school. You wouldn't send them to like Hindu school or whatever, like my dad did. And struck also by, the noise, the traffic, the animals, the gigantic insects, the small cute lizards that I didn't think were that cute, and the poverty and the aggression and the violence. And just, I saw people there just hitting and kicking animals and like kids and like cars and like things in the marketplace. Lots of people were carrying guns. I wasn't allowed out of the house unless I had an escort with me. I thought, my uncle and my aunt were rich rather than being sort of, lower middle class, but I didn't realize that was because when labor is cheap, you can afford to have people working in your house as a maid and as a cook. Like they had a cook. I thought this was the pinnacle of luxury. It was just a rearrangement of everything that I had taken for granted back home, and that my parents hadn't really bothered to tell me and my brother much about. Like they didn't ever sit us down and say, this is where we came from. This is what it was like. This is, here's where we went to school. Here's where we this, that. So the trip was really eye-opening for me. And particularly, I think also in that sense that, yes, we understood that our ancestors were people that had been taken from another country, and that the British did everything they could to kind of snip the tape that, of history, that so it would kind of flap loose in the wind. We didn't know where any of our indentured ancestors had come from. We couldn't even guess like the village or anything like that with a last name like Mohammed. Where are you supposed to go to guess? On my mom's side, the last name was Singh. Well, great, can't even narrow it down to like a region or anything. It just, it was very, very interesting to see where they had come from and why they had again left to come to Canada. So, that last leaving, or feeling like you were being driven out because you didn't have a future. I'm very interested in my work, not just in the, colonial, decolonial idea too, but why people leave places, why they're pushed out or taken or stolen or enslaved, and why they later on choose to stay or choose to leave.
Yeah, and I think that's fairly well known for the majority of people in the contiguous North America, for the Black population in the Caribbean. But for people like you and I, who have much more Asian roots, it's a lot more confusing. Most Chinese Caribbean people come from also indentured servitude. I think my family might be an exception because I have weird great-grandfather who fought in the Civil War. Half Black man in the Chinese Civil War, who knew? But it is a little bit different, I think, when you're coming from that non-majority idea of the Caribbean, and sort of like how things moved, why things moved, is always something to kind of dig into history to understand, and then also to explore. Therese.
Yeah, honestly, I'm not really sure how far I've gotten within my writing exploring colonial, anti-colonial, and specifically imperialist narratives in the Caribbean. I'm still trying to navigate that, but I am like open to other narratives and other research that I can find. But I know that when I want to write about the Caribbean, I want to write about Black people, and I want to write about our stories, and I want to focus on a lot of joy and people just taking pride and honor in their own culture as they live there or as they move elsewhere. As I get older, I learn more about like the history of like Grenada from my parents, and my brother would talk about like the revolution, with Maurice Bishop and other political figures, and other protests and like political strife and like curfews. Like we were talking about, like how some parts of the world today had a curfew for coronavirus. And she's like, oh, that reminds me of like when we would go to curfew parties during the revolution. You just go to a party and like you can't leave the party. You have to party all night because it's a curfew and there are just soldiers outside. And I was like, what? But you talk about like, when America invaded Grenada and like where she was and what she was doing. And I was like, what? Like this is so interesting. But I want to learn more about that, and I want to incorporate that into my speculative work. But I want to do that in a way that's respectful, and that's typically like when you talk about when or at least maybe online when we talk about like the diaspora wars or like things like that. like the considered problem with it is that it often ignores that fraught history or the current socio-political issues and treats like the motherland as this beautiful utopic like place. It's just I'm just gonna take the aesthetic, you know, I'm just gonna take the palm trees and the coconuts and I'm not gonna focus on the poverty, things like that, right? And that's something I'm very pointedly aware of as I write, and something that I would like want to reconcile when I choose what to write about going forward, because I'm an adult and I can like do that research and I can make those decisions. But in the diaspora, I do think that there are pockets of like, you know, cultural influences. I think that's people will always find each other, you know, no matter where they are in the world, which is really nice. And that's the effect that community has. I lived in the Caribbean for 3 years when I was a child for my dad's job. He worked for, I think there's a Caribbean bank or something like that. Like he worked for the bank. So we moved to Grenada when I was 8. And then when I was 9, we moved to Trinidad and spent 2 years in Trinidad. And there are very few things I strongly remember. I remember an earthquake. I remember when I was living in Trinidad when Hurricane Ivan hit Grenada. So I wasn't in Grenada, but I remember seeing pictures of like our old house and how it was completely destroyed. But there are also things that you don't remember, you know, I haven't lived there for a very long time, or when I was there when I was a child. And there are also things that children in general aren't aware of when they're, you know, living in these places, things that they're protected from, that you will see differently if you go back as an adult. So I wanted to actually do that, you know, this year. I got a grant to write, and I was like, I want to go to like several islands in the Caribbean, and I want to just like live there as like a 25-year-old person. And Corona hit, and I was like, no, I can't do that. But like, you know, we lived in a large house, we had in a gated community, and we had a maid, and we went to private school, and I thought this was normal. But you know, there were also kidnappings and bomb threats and like several things happening at once. And there's just so much more that exists than what you see, like, you know, on the news or like in books. But like when you are an adult and you are able to write about these things, there's a lot more responsibility that you have to take in your time and actions and your power.
Yeah, and it's really interesting how memory kind of affects us, because I remember we visited Cuba with my grandmother several years ago, and she was kind of struck by the I guess I don't want to say the poverty level, but also sort of the poverty level. But she had lived in Jamaica for many years. And so I remember thinking that was a little bit weird, because I'm like, you're also from the Caribbean, you know what this environment is like. But you know, as we age, as we get older and get more comfortable to life on the North American continent proper, you kind of get, I don't want to say complacent, but certainly an element of detachment from the realities of what living in the Caribbean is sort of like, especially if you have a connection to it and you can't just kind of go there looking at it as a quaint tourist spot, like I'm sure many people do. So each of the countries within the Caribbean have their own unique identities, but when we move past the region, we kind of get lumped together and all of our cultures get homogenized. How do we recognize, reconcile, and repair this? Evan?
Okay, how do we recognize, reconcile, and repair the homogenization of Caribbean culture? In this PowerPoint presentation, I will. No, I'm just kidding. But I think that that's a really tough one. And I think that I'm going to first of all just say I don't know that I have the answer, because
I don't think any of us do, but it's certainly a conversation to have.
Yeah. And I say I don't think I don't think I have the answer, because it's to me so much of that gets tied into power dynamics that the different societies that we exist in have, and also the narratives that the different societies sort of spin. And until I very much believe in the power of stories. I believe in the power of stories to affect the way that people think about what they can achieve in life, what they can even explore as an avenue for achievement. And so that homogenization is part of the narrative, at least in the West, right? And so then it is in part, at least, up to people like us, I think, to tell stories and to change the narrative enough that what is currently the common narrative gets broken up a little bit more. That can't be the sum total of the solution. It won't be enough, I don't think, but it is a part of it, in that the more people can become experienced with other ideas and stories and lived experiences, the more they can understand how similar we all are across the planet, but also that each individual person and each individual culture and people do have different perspectives on the way they move through life in the world. So storytelling is a powerful part of sort of dehomogenizing a place that typically is looked at from a very sort of narrow lens.
Yeah, definitely. Nandy.
Like Evan, I'm not sure. And sometimes I am nervous that writing secondary worlds can make this worse. In my own book, I tried to go to lengths to make it clear that there were different islands, and each island has its own specific culture because the indigenous that were there before they were colonized had their own different cultures. But it's hard to tell how much this comes across, especially to readers who are already biased toward considering the Caribbean a monolith. So I suspect the way to combat this is to have more writers, diverse writers from all the different islands, diversity within diversity.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the things about fantasy is that sometimes it's a little bit too easy to put things into nice, clean little boxes, but humanity is incredibly messy. And sometimes one of the best things to do is to allow that messiness to influence and get injected into fantasy writing. And maybe that's part of the solution. Preemi.
Yeah, no, this is a super interesting question, and I don't think that I have a good answer for that either. But listening to Evan talk too, I was struck very much by that idea that, yeah, it is the power of stories, and stories are what have, I think, homogenized it in the first place. If you've never been to the Caribbean, your idea of it is set up from the Pirates of the Caribbean, possibly the ride, mostly the movies, probably, Cool Runnings, the Jonestown Massacre, cruise ships, and maybe an all-inclusive resort that you went to for your friend's wedding when you were like 28, right? So the stories are pretty generic that are being told because they're being told by capitalism. They're being told by the things that make money. They're being told by the 10 to 15% white majority that controls a lot of the media that's told about everywhere. The one that tried to tell us there was a savage Africa and a yellow menace, it's not the people from the area that are telling the stories. So I think that is exactly what's needed to try to correct this and individualize the cultures and the islands and the not island, is to get away from the media, get away from the news, and let individual writers and people from the areas tell the stories in their own way. And I know already, as soon as I say that, that's tricky because what publishing in general is looking for is kind of a little more formulaic sometimes, and you'll get things whacked back at you like a tennis ball if it doesn't fit into a fairly small-ish box. And there's a little bit of experimentation allowed, especially more these days. But if a white editor gets a hold of something, they might just be like, I can't connect with this. And I think our goal is to get enough stories out there that people will start to learn around them and connect. And in particular for Guyana, I'm curious about how this is going to go now that they've found oil and are going to be a petrostate. I think that changes their narrative, and I think they'll have to start thinking of themselves differently. And I think that process may have already started, and I'm actually a little alarmed for how it's going.
That's gonna be, yeah. Taraz?
When I saw this question, I thought it's like, how do we reconcile and repair this? And who's we? Who's doing the reconciling and repairing here? So we is a big word, but I think that diaspora writers in particular can work on carving our own unique voices. If I want to write about Grenada, or I'll just continue to do that, right? And that's fine. But also getting to know and reading the writers who currently live in the Caribbean and who are already doing work. Last year, I discovered that there were writing festivals in the Caribbean, and I was like, what? Can I go there? That's Bocas. I was like, wow. That's something that I think that should know and should want to find out. and we can work together to uplift both like diaspora writers and like writers on the island. Like, you know, I'm sure their literature is like beautiful and it's diverse and it's great, and we should be reading their works as well. I agree with what's been said regarding like power dynamics and their role in affecting societies, and like whose stories get told, like whose stories are worthy of being told, and who benefits from these narratives. And like people who have been affected by these narratives, which is like everyone, but also who know they're not true, can work in like smaller ways to sort of disrupt that and to introduce more nuance and diversity in our writing, but also like in the demand for the stories that we want to read about and the stories that we want publishers to publish, if there's a demand there. But also like those who create those narratives just have to work to be more responsible and educate themselves in the future. And that's like something that we can't force them to do. They have to do that. And if we need to break the system, then we just will. So
yeah, and I think the literature festivals is a great way to have to not only showcase but to form and foster a community of Caribbean writers and Caribbean diaspora writers, which brings us to the last question to wrap things up. What would you like to see for future diaspora writers? And I think we already kind of talked about, you know, maybe a Caribbean Canadian or just Caribbean outside of the Caribbean Literature Festival. But, you know, Evan?
Yeah, I think that for me, it would be that diaspora writers or writers in general who are people of color, Black and people of color, Black and Indigenous people of colors, I should say, have the same opportunities that, to be very, very honest, white writers have, which is that they can be mediocre. They can tell stories that have been told 1,000 times before and hit all those same tropes and just say, but this is my version of it, and people are accepting of that. They can try completely experimental things that have nothing to do with their whiteness or with their culture and their history, and that's all fine too. And you know, we just don't have those same opportunities, and because it's sort of like there's literature. And then there's literature from people of color, and that's not really what it should be in the end. And when we get to the point where we should all be in the end, it will all just be literature. It will all just be writing and storytelling. And yes, we will all have our individual sort of stories to tell and our individual spins to put on stories, but they all get looked at from a lens that starts to become actually meritocratic, as opposed to just having the appearance of meritocracy when the meritocracy does not exist whatsoever. So that's what I hope for, a more equitable and meritocratic system that views all stories as stories while appreciating the differences that each of us bring based on our lived experiences and our pasts.
That is a fantastic future. I would love that. Nandy?
Yeah, I couldn't say it any better than Evan, really. More book deals, more money, more room to experiment. More writers, Caribbean writers and Caribbean diaspora writers being published and normalized within the landscape of literature.
Rumi?
Yeah, no, very much same here. Community, visibility, opportunity, support especially, I think. And I don't want it to seem like the way some of these calls look like now, I don't want it to seem like a handout, like, oh, you poor diaspora writers. I want it to recognize that there are writers who deliberately and intentionally, and hopefully in a literary fashion, have one foot in two cultures and can write intelligently about that. I would like for there to be some support along those lines specifically. And also, pie in the sky wish for more support from our own communities. I cannot tell you how much my family does not want any of us to go into the arts. And how I had to write secretly for years, and how when I told my parents I had a book deal, their response was basically bleh. Intelligence is very valued. The arts, yeah, not so much. That's not something they want you to go into.
Asian. Therese.
I feel this. I feel all of this. Okay. Oh my God, the memories. So yeah, so I would like to see, you know, continued strength and bravery in our writers and in us, because we are strong and we are brave. We are telling our stories. I want to see more support and more infrastructure for us to succeed. Like Primi said, like no handouts. I want it to be committed. I want it to be purposeful, and I want like follow through, because like everybody like now like in the summer has been like, oh, if you know, if you're a Black writer, you know, like I want, you know, send me your work. And I'm like, okay, but like 2 years from now, what are you gonna do?
Yeah.
Right? Is it still there? You know, again, like more publishers, more journals accepting our work, but also like I want to know who other people are, like who, like I don't want to be surprised when I find another Grenadian. You know, I want like let's I want to see each other. I want to see my people succeed. I want to see all of us succeed. So that's what I want.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, like, just finding out we have at least 5 of us in Canada. I wonder who else is there. That would be a great thing.
We should
So
make
yeah,
a group.
Yeah,
Should.
like a Twitter list or something.
Yep.
Like
I
a
mean,
like
yeah,
a bigger,
specifically,
like an
that would be
organization. Like let's
God.
go.
Just make a Slack group or something.
Slack group.
Okay. I am not coming up with not seeing any audience questions. So to wrap up, do you want to let us know where we can find you and any upcoming work you want to talk about? And then we'll close up the panel. Evan?
Yeah, Ashley, thank you very much for a wonderful panel and for all the extremely thoughtful questions that you took the time to sort of prepare for us. I just have a book that came out on Tuesday. It is called The Fires of Vengeance. It's book 2 in the Burning series, the first book, which was The Rage of Dragons. If you like secondary fantasy and lots of action and sort of some thoughts on cycles of violence, colonization, oppression, some systemic violence, maybe give the book a shot. I don't know. Hopefully you'll enjoy it. Most frequently, I can be found on Twitter. That seems to be the platform that sort of makes the most sense for me in my head and mind. So I'm there, and yeah. And again, thank you very much, Ashley, for putting this together and all the questions.
Yeah, totally. Nandy?
Yeah, you can find me on my website, www.nandytaylor.com. I'm also on Twitter, Nandy_Taylor. I'm on Instagram, Nandy T Author. And my book Given is available pretty much all bookstores, IndieBound, Indigo. And the paperback is coming out January 5th, which has a new, brand spanking new cover. And yeah, I just want to say thank you again for having me on the panel. This has been a wonderful conversation, a necessary conversation, and I really respect all of you, and I had a great time chatting with you.
Primi?
Yeah, no, thank you, Ashley. This was fantastically moderated, and I could literally listen to everybody talk all day. Yeah, I can be found on my website as well, www.premimohammed.com. I'm also on Twitter a lot at PrimiSource. I can put my info in the chat or something if people need it. And next thing coming up is that I'm allowed to talk about is the sequel to my debut novel, which is coming out in March from Rebellion Publishing, and it's called A Broken Darkness. And I'm terrified because I had second book syndrome. So hopefully people like it. It's real.
It's real and it's coming.
I can never answer this question. Okay, so things I'm doing. I have random poetry places. My website is www.theresemasonpierre.com. I'm also on Twitter. Derek is tweeting and he's tagging all of us. So I'm there at Therese and Pierre. Also, I am running a conference with Augur Magazine. Evan will be there. And it's called AugurCon. It's on November 28th. So just come check us out. And like we have a number of panels and different writers in speculative literature in Canada. So it'd be lovely to see you there. And also Augur magazines are our next issues coming out around the end of November as well. So we have a number of really cool writers that we want to showcase and publish. And yeah.
That's gonna be fun. Yeah, so thank you all. You can find me over on Twitter as Ashes Emoji, and my barely touched website, which is just AE-DENG. .wordpress.com because I have no money for a domain. So thank you all, everyone. This has been a great conversation, one that could probably go on for much longer, but we are out of time. CanCon's got other stuff happening, as Bren mentioned earlier. Looking forward to the rest of the programming for this plague year. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you.